Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon, and today we're going to be looking at all the cards, or all the interesting cards, I think, from the Breakthrough set, the latest set to come out. It's going to be, I think, in a week's time. Pre-releases have already started, and we've managed to find all the scans. I'm using these scans from Bulbapedia. I'm going to put the IRL in the description, so please check that out if you want to see all the scans. I've just picked them off from there, so let's get into it. I'm going to go through everything that I think is interesting, semi-playable, whatever. So let's hop straight into it with some of the grass types. And one of the first things to mention is, now that we look at grass types, we always have to consider Forest of Giant Plants, the stadium that we have, which means we can actually evolve these stage 1 and 2 Pokemon that we'll be looking at on the very first turn. So there is potential for this new Parasect that we have here to attack on the very first turn. So Parasect is a 100 HP grass type. Its first attack is probably the most interesting one. For a single colourless energy, it's quite important that it's colourless, makes it fairly splashable. It allows you to choose 3 of your Pokemon, and for each of those Pokemon, search your deck for a different type of basic energy and attach it to that Pokemon, and then shuffle your deck afterwards. So this is a pretty interesting attack, with the potential to get 4 energy into play on the very first turn. Seems very powerful. It's slightly hindered by the fact that it has to be different types of energy cards, so it's almost like you'd play this in a boxy style build where you have a bunch of different things trying to hit for weakness. Now, I do feel like maybe the evolutions that we have are probably a better way of hitting for weakness around the board, but getting this much energy into play is quite interesting. And we do also have a new Smeargle that I'm going to discuss later on in the video, that allows you to switch energy up with other things. So if you use Parasect to get like irrelevant energy into play, you can use Smeargle to later on switch that to a relevant energy to the Pokemon that you need. So sometimes you will be getting a couple of things out. Maybe the new supporter Bridget can help that. It allows you to find 3 basic Pokemon or a single EX. So I guess in this situation with a Parasect deck, you'll look to get 3 bench Pokemon and then use Colourful Spores to put an energy on each of them. So it seems like it's a lot of setup to get this much energy acceleration. Basically what I'm trying to get across is it requires a lot of setup for this amount of energy, and I feel like there's other energy accelerators out there right now that's going to be more effective than Parasect overall. However, getting 4 energy into play does seem pretty crazy, and if someone can get this working, I think it could be a lot of fun. Moving on, we have the Cine Sage, Simisear, and Simipour. They all have very similar attacks. Their first attack is not very useful. It allows you to recover 3 energy from your discard pile and put it into the hand. It does have some synergy with their second attack, which is Hand Fling for each of them. It does 10 times the number of cards in your hand, which is pretty cool. You know, you can try and stack up your hand with things like Slurpuff, multiple of these using tasting each turn. We also have the item Lucky Helmet. When we get attacked, we get to draw 2 cards, so there is some potential here, seeing as though you can have all 3 of these in a single deck, because they do just require double colourless energy. There's potential to try and hit for weakness on some popular things, and rely on basically having something like a 10 card hand, and then the Hand Fling doing the weakness to try and hit, you know, better numbers. So it does seem like it's going to be a bit of a roguish deck, not anything too spectacular, but you know, they are 90 HP, easily searchable stage 1s. Also the Cine Sage you can get on the first turn, remember, because we do have Forest of Giant Plants. So there is something here, I imagine, and it would be something fun to play around with for those rogue testers out there. Next up we have our first Break Evolution. Break Evolution's a new mechanic. It's basically like playing an extra stage on your Pokemon. You do have to wait a turn to Break Evolve. In the case of Chestnut specifically, we do have Forest to try and sort of cheat our way into breaking early. But normally it's like as if you were playing a stage 2 Pokemon onto a stage 1, or playing a stage 3 onto a previous stage 2, which is the case for Chestnut. So let's look at, first of all, the new regular Chestnut to the left of the screen. It's a stage 2, 160 HP is quite nice, and it has 2 attacks. The first is Spike Lariat, sorry. It does 60, and if your opponent's active has any damage counters on it, it does an additional 60 to make 120 damage. This is pretty cool. You can use maybe bats to put those damage counters on there. But overall, I don't think it's too strong. Its second attack, Adamantine Press, which is a very cool name, It's quite expensive. It's an extra grass on top of the 3 we already had attached to do 100 damage, and during your opponent's next turn, you reduce damage done by 20. So it's a pretty tanky Pokemon, 160 HP plus resisting 20 if you are using that second attack. You can throw on stuff like Hard Charms as well to make it even more difficult. We also do, of course, have the Herbal Energy to try and do some healing. So it's a bit of a tanky Pokemon. It does require a lot of setup. But then we look at the Break Pokemon. If you want to be even more tanky and even more setty-uppy, it has an additional 30 HP for the Break Evolve. So 190 on a non-EX is pretty crazy to take out. A lot of investment just to deal with one non-EX. And its attack is Tough Hammer. You do 160 damage, 30 to yourself, and this attack also does 30 to one of your opponent's bench. So pretty decent numbers. Like I say, you can put Muscle Band on here to hit 180, which is a pretty decent number, as we all know. So I feel like it's a very expensive attack, but obviously it's decent in terms of the numbers that it can start hitting and also spreading. It's something to bear in mind. We could use a previous Chestnut that we have, the one from XY base set, that has the Spiky Shield ability, putting 3 counters whenever we get damaged, even if we are knocked out, onto the opponent's defending Pokemon. So it could be a way of getting more damage counters into play, which is pretty decent, you know. But overall, I think his attacks, just in general, are too expensive. And the commitment to get into not only a Stage 2, but essentially a Stage 3, is quite a lot to ask for. And even though it does have this much HP, I think it's quite easy over the course of a couple of turns to deal with the first Chestnut, and then your opponent is sort of ruined, not really having much else to do. They're still struggling to set up a second Chestnut overall, so I feel like just too expensive, to be honest. None of the Chestnuts are really that cheap attackers, but it's, you know, one to look out for. Big beefy HP and some good tanking options there. Next up, we have a Vivillon. It's another interesting Stage 2 grass type. It has the ability Energy Color. Once during your turn, you may flip a coin, and if heads, search your deck for a basic energy and attach it to one of your Pokemon. Now, attaching to from the deck is really nice in general. It helps you thin the deck out. It means you don't need it in hand. You don't lose anything from the hand or anything like that. But the coin flip is really a bit of a pain. It's good to notice that it could be for any energy. So essentially, any deck can have acceleration now through Vivillon. But again, it's one of these. It's a Stage 2. You need to commit quite a bit to the deck if you want to get going. You do have the Forest to try and do it from the very first turn. But like I said, very much the same case as the Parasite. We have more reliable means of attaching energy via things like Bronzong, and there's also a new Magnezone I want to go over later on as well. So Vivillon seems kind of cool if you really need to get attaching on other things, but overall I think it's underwhelming. Next up, let's move into the Fire types. An interesting Stage 2 once again. Looks like we're being thrown a lot of evolution Pokemon in this set. It's another Stage 2, Typhlosion. Having 150 HP is really, really nice for a Stage 2. And its first attack is the one that we're looking at here. Massive Eruption, doing 80. And you discard the top 5 cards of your deck and do 80 times the number of energy cards you discarded. And this is potentially a very powerhouse deck. I mean, with just one single attachment, you can be, if you discard 3 energy, you know, you're knocking out pretty much everything in format. So that's pretty awesome. How we can sort of manipulate our own deck to make sure there's a lot of energy in there. I think the best way is going to be using like a turbo engine, lots of acrobikes, lots of compressors to try and thin the deck as best as possible. And the Massive Eruption will continue to thin our deck out, but also we'll have a bunch of things like Energy Recycler and Super Rod to recover just energy, basically. Only recovering energy and also Pokemon to keep our Typhlosions obviously into play. We can try and, you know, skew the odds to make it that we have a lot of fire energy left in the deck when we've sort of thinned out the rest of our deck of everything else. So I think in the mid to late game, this can start really rolling, but it will probably have a bit of a struggle in the early game. And seeing as though stuff like Lucario Bats is running around, I feel like it can absolutely destroy this deck, just because you won't be able to set up too many Typhlosions in the first place. And you're really going to struggle to get these Massive Eruptions going very consistently. So it feels like it's pretty strong. It's a single energy attachment. Again, it's one I want to try out. but the build of the deck itself is going to be quite interesting to see how it all comes together. We've seen discarding mechanics before be fairly painful because obviously you can't really manage it yourself. There is a new Glalie that has Premonition, which I'll be going over, but I don't feel like it really changes much. Like, you can see the top 5, but you can't change the top 5. So it seems interesting, but again, a bit roguish, a bit out there right now. So far, we're just seeing interesting cards rather than very, very playable ones. And I think, unfortunately, this is going to be one of those sets where we see a lot of interesting stuff, but not a lot of completely top tier. Like, this is absolutely amazing cards. Sorry to say that, guys, but I do think, for the most part, the cards I'm going over are sort of there, have potential, could work in a rogue deck, but not really going to be that strong. And it feels like Typhlosion, sort of epitomizes that with his first attack. So let's look at the first EXs, the EX in Mega. It's going to be the Houndoom, and this is actually a very playable combination of cards. I think these are very, very good. Houndoom has 170 HP, the regular one, which is, you know, average for an EX. His first attack, Melting Horn, discards 2 from your opponent's deck. Again, it's kind of meh. It's something to do on the first turn, I guess, but ultimately it's not too big of a deal. His second attack is quite nice, though. Grand Flame does 50 for 2 fire energy, and you get to attach a fire from your discard pile to one of your bench. So accelerating from the discard pile, we know it's very strong. We've seen it with Mega Manectric do really well. Obviously, Mega Man does more energy than Houndoom, but it's easier to set up Houndoom. You can do this potentially on the first turn with a good Blacksmith combo, so getting that sort of energy in play is really, really good, I'd say, for the opening turns. Not too much damage, but again, it's something to work with. It sort of reminds me of a combination of Manectric and also the Virizion that we used to have in play, because, you know, 50 damage is a familiar number, and attaching energy as well, so it seems like a good way to get extra energy into play. Fire types have so much means of getting energy back through Blacksmith. Also, we have Mega Turbo for Mega Houndoom itself, and we have the new Burning Energy as well, which if you discard an energy with one of your own attacks, you get to replay it onto your fire type Pokemon. So this has great synergy with the Mega, which we'll look at now. It has 210 HP, which is kind of low. It's the same as Mega Manectric, so we know that it's sort of difficult right now to one-shot Mega Man unless you're being something like a Rayquaza or Groudon based deck, so, or if you're hitting for weakness, I guess. But 210 is decent enough for Houndoom, I'd say. And it has the attack Inferno Fang, which still for 2 fire energy, you're doing 80 damage. 80 base is not too bad. And if you choose to discard all fire attached to it, you get to do an extra 80 damage. So 160, that's a slightly nicer number. Not quite perfect maths. Obviously 180 would be favourable, or even 170. However, 160 is still decent, chugging away quite easily. Like we say, Blacksmith can recover energy, Burning Energy recovers itself, and we have the non-Mega, which can also Grand Flame energy back. So plenty of reasons why you can pretty much chain Inferno Fang almost all game once you get going with Houndoom. So either you're hitting this 80 to hit on the lower things, or you're hitting 160 to try and, you know, really threaten EXs and even threaten 2 shots on Megas. Even like Manectric that likes to use Rough Seas to heal, you're still going to be 2-shotting that very effectively. So overall, I think Houndoom's very nice. Just fire types in general have so much support, especially attaching extra cards. It feels like this Mega Houndoom is going to be pretty playable overall. One of its weaknesses is going to be, of course, it's weak to water physically, and that could sort of pave the way for Seismitoad to become a lot stronger again. I think Seismitoad's not too strong right now. It works with the bats quite nicely, but its output is fairly low, and giving your opponent, you know, a good matchup for Toad, they're just going to jump on that straight away. So Houndoom, pretty decent card. I don't think it'll ever become best deck in format just because Toad can always keep it in its place, basically. But yeah, pretty good one. Moving on to the water types, we have a very interesting Starmie card. It's a 90 HP water, so pretty nice and searchable thanks to Level Ball. And it has 2 attacks. The first is Deep Sea Swirl, allows you to shuffle and draw 7. It can be nice in early turns if you're really struggling to get anything. You get to, you know, basically refresh your hand. But it's really the second attack, Balance Bind, that I like to look at here. It does just 30 damage, which isn't too much, but we can slap on Muscle Man to do an even 50. And the effect is really interesting. If you and your opponent have the same number of bench Pokemon, your opponent's active is now paralyzed. So auto paralysis, as we know, we've seen with Aselgor in the past, it is really, really strong and painful to deal with. So the question is, how can we maintain the same number of bench Pokemon as our opponent? Well, we have cards like Unknown and Robosub, which can physically be on our bench, but we can discard them anytime we like. We have Revive to recover these sorts of cards. Like, recovering Unknowns is pretty much the ideal here, because you can have it for when your opponent is trying to play more bench Pokemon down, and then you can revive back Unknowns, and then as you start to kill their Pokemon, you can get rid of your Unknowns again. You can also play Target Whistle to try and put more basics. If your opponent is trying to not bench anything, basically, you can use Target Whistle to force them if they do have Pokemon in their discard pile. So there's a lot of ways that you can try and maintain this lock, and we know that Insta or Permanent Paralysis is very, very strong, so pairing this up would be really awesome. The reason I've thrown the Ariados picture in there as well is because the Poisonous Nest ability could be very helpful for Starmie, because you could force a situation where your opponent actually dies to the poison, going back into your turn, so you can continue the balance bind, so that they never get an attack off. It's something that Aselgor decks used to do, and we can try and replicate that by having Starmie and Ariados together. So I think this has a lot of potential. I definitely want to try this deck out. It does feel like a lot of fun, sort of difficult to maintain overall, and I feel like it's sort of weak to stuff like Judge and stuff like that, but overall, if you can continue that paralysis lock, it does seem like it could be pretty deadly, so one I definitely want to try out. Next up is another interesting Stage 1, Octillery. This is one of the better ones, I think. It's 90 HP, so again, searchable with Level Ball, which is very nice, and it has this ability called Abyss Hand. Once during your turn, you may draw until you have 5 in your hand, and this is absolutely phenomenal. I'm a huge, huge fan of this. I feel like any deck that has the bench space for an Octillery should pretty much be playing it. This is a throwback to Electrode that we had in Plasma Freeze. You can see it on the right there, with the ability Magnetic Draw. And this card did see some play, definitely in like old Blastoise decks, and even in some Virgin decks before people started using Roserade. Electrode was used to refresh the hand and sort of end-proof yourself, and back then it was only 4 cards, and Octillery gets you an extra card each turn potentially, so it feels like it's a lot stronger, and seeing as though Electrode did see play back then, I feel like Octillery is bound to see play over the course of its duration, basically. Like, looking back at previous cards, you may not think one card is too different, but if you think about Professor Oak's new theory, Pont was a card that was a 4 of in every deck when Heart Gold Soul Silver was out, and we currently have Shauna, which gets you 1 card less, and that's pretty much everyone hesitates to put Shauna in their deck. They'd rather not play more than 1 or 2 if they had the option, so that 1 card difference is pretty big, and seeing as though Electrode was relatively playable, you have to assume that Octillery is going to be a very playable card. And it's also a big thumbs up to all those budget players who don't want to shell out on any more Shamans. Now you can throw a couple of Octillery in your deck to try and remain consistent and have good draw power throughout the entire game. So Octillery gets a big thumbs up from me. I think it's a very good card in the set. So next up we have another combination of EX and Mega EX Pokemon. This time it's going to be Glalie, a water type. So the first one has 170 HP, which is, you know, again, pretty decent, on the slightly lower side, but I think we can deal with that. His first attack, Ice Breath, is pretty nice. You get to coin flip for paralysis, which is pretty cool. I mean, stalling your opponent for a turn is nice against sort of speedier decks. It can also be a good utility against Seismitoad, so that's all pretty good. It can try and keep you healthy and basically alive so that you can start using your slightly more expensive attacks. In this case, it's Instant Freeze, which does a base of 50, which is very, very poor. However, you get to do an extra 100 damage if you have the same number of cards in hand as your opponent. And this can be manipulated by a couple of supporters that we have. Battle Reporter allows you to draw until you have the same amount of cards in your opponent's. And you can also use Judge to shuffle both yours and your opponent's hands until you have 4. So you're trying to manipulate both your opponent. Sometimes, if you want to use the Judge, it's going to be quite a disruptive based deck. And if you want to have Battle Reporter, that's, you know, maintaining your hand as well. So it's kind of annoying you have to play these sort of fringe supporters, but it's a fairly good number. 150 with that Muscle Band, we're hitting 170, which is often enough to kill EX Pokemon. And it's kind of decent. It has a weakness to Metal, which is a bit of a shame because Aegislash is kind of good. Bronzong is always going to be around, so I don't think Glalie's ever going to get too powerful. But that instant freeze attack is decent. And then looking at the Mega, we get to go up to 220 HP, which is pretty decent, you know. Pretty average for a Mega, really. And it has Cryo Mouth for the attack. The same cost as the instant freeze. It does 100 base damage, which is, you know, straight off the bat a lot better. And if you have 10 or more damage counters on yourself, you get to do 250 total damage. So that's an increase of 150. That's pretty crazy. So thinking about decks like Manectric and Giratina, these all swing for 100. They don't have any one-shotters in their deck, basically. So they're forced really to attack into Glalies so that you can get big damage on this Cryomouth to deal with pretty much anything on their board. So pretty decent output there. Overall, I think the Glalie combination is pretty good. I think there's some cause or some argument, I guess, for playing just the non-Mega, but also in having the Mega in your deck, maybe just a 1 or 2 of even, can sort of give you outs when you don't have the same hand size as your opponent. Maybe they're down to 1 and you have no way to reduce your hand size anymore. Having the Cryomouth, doing a base 100 is still decent enough damage for the most part. And, you know, if they do trigger that big attack cost, you can be getting some huge KOs on pretty much everything in format. So I think the biggest worry for stuff like Glalie is going to be Rayquaza. They get to just completely ignore the Cryomouth, and you can't really one-shot them in any way. So something for Glalie to have to deal with. But other than that, it seems like it could be quite strong. There's a lot of decks in format right now struggling to one-shot this guy, so you can often get the effective Cryomouth working. So pretty decent EXs there. Next up we have, once again, it's another stage 2 that has this pretty decent ability. It's Empoleon. We've seen this as an Archie's ace in the whole target before. We know that in Expanded, there's the Empoleon that has Diving Search. This Empoleon has Dignified Fighter. Each of your basic Pokemon's attacks do 20 more damage to your opponent's active, and that's before applying weakness and resistance as well, so pretty decent here. I can see, like we were saying with the Glalie, you probably want to slap a Muscle Band on there for instant freeze, but you could even, if you want to tech out your deck, go for an Archie style build and play a couple of Empoleon to increase your base output, which is obviously needed for the Glalie, because it, you know, if you don't have the same hand size, you're only doing 50, so Empoleon can up that to 70 to slightly help you out, I guess. It means you can like 2-shot EXs if you the following turn get the trigger. So Dignified Fighter sort of decent. I guess the argument would be like just play Muscle Band, because that's so much easier to get out. The only real thing is if you're really struggling against Giratina, you might find a way to get Empoleon in your deck somehow. Obviously Empoleon is stackable as well, so if you're really able to chain Archies basically, you could get a huge output on just basic Pokemon. Overall, I don't think it'll see too much play, just because Muscle Band's so much easier for the most part. And nothing struggles with Giratina so much that they would sort of take Muscle Band out and make the room for an Archie build, because the deck basically has to function around getting an Archie off if you want to effectively use Empoleon, and not many decks have the space to do that. So overall, I think it's a fun ability, but it's not going to be too playable. Next up, again, it's a stage 2 with some interesting attacks. Mainly the first one, Frigid Breath, does 30 damage, and until the end of your next turn, each player can't play supporter or stadium cards from his or her hand. Now, this is reminiscent of the Exeggutor that had the blockade. Here, you do lock out stadiums additionally, but also you lock yourself out of supporters. So it's probably going to be one of these decks that needs to run Octillery to maintain hand size. And we know that Exeggutor did so well because they denied energy, so you're probably going to fill your deck with some hammers and some other disruptive cards like Headringer perhaps. But the issue is you're locking yourself out of supporters as well. And a lot of the time Exeggutor was doing well because it could use Flare Grunts, Xerosics, Lysanders to really prevent your opponent from doing much. And here you don't have that option because you know, you're locking yourself out with the attack. So slightly more damage than the Exeggutor makes it slightly nicer. It is a stage 2, however, and also you can't play your own supporters, so very sort of detrimental to yourself at the same time. So overall, I don't think it's too good, but it's a pretty playful card. I mean, again, it's an Archie target if you really want to go down that route. And And it does sort of make sense, because if you can't use supporters from then on, you may as well just play like 4 Archie and no other supporters, and really just bank on getting the Vanillux going. But the output is pretty low, and if your opponent is able to finally get those attacks off, it's going to be a bit of an issue for Vanillux overall. So one to play around with, but also one you should, you know, use with caution, because denying your own supporters is horrible. Like, if you've been on the receiving end of Executor, like, why would you want to do that to yourself, really? Pretty interesting, however. So let's look at the new Raichu and the Raichu Break. I think there's some playability to the regular Raichu. It's a 90 HP stage 1 with free retreat, so that's pretty good stats all around. It works nicely with level ball and all that good stuff. And its first attack is Thunderclap Shot, which does 50 damage to each of your opponent's EX Pokemon. And this is pretty decent. 50 damage sniping is really nice. And we also have Wide Lens, which I think makes this attack a whole lot nicer, because this essentially makes him the Shaman EX killer. You get to do 100 to each Shaman EX your opponent has in play. This would be obviously insane against like Rayquaza EX decks. Just anything with Skyfield that likes to flood the field of like plenty of Shaman. I know some Toad Tina like to throw a few down. You know, the Dragon Tina as well likes to play it. Even pretty much every deck plays at least one Shaman. So being able to snipe that for 100 and then use something like Golbats and Crobats to get those additional snipes, straight away you're going up 3 or 4 prizes very, very quickly. So Raichu does seem to have some playability. The attack cost is kind of awkward, but also kind of nice. I don't think I'd play it in combination with the other, the Circle Circuit Raichu that we have in play. It seems like it would have to be its own dedicated deck, like a sniping-based build. But it's one to play around with. Raichu does gain Bridget as well, so you can flood the field of Pikachus and Golbats, and Zubats quite easily, so there's some potential there, definitely. And then looking at the Break evolution, you get to have an extra 40 HP, going up to 130 is, you know, kind of okay. You're still pretty much one-shottable by everything in format. I guess you stay out of range of, like, Giratina and stuff, which is interesting. And his attack is Grand Bolt for a double colorless and a lightning energy. You get to do 170 and discard all energy attached. Overall, I don't think this is going to be too playable. You might want to play, like I say, just one. For the most part, I'm looking at most of the Break evolutions very skeptically. It's pretty much like playing a Stage 2, which I'm not a fan of at all. We know that not many Stage 2s are very successful right now. So putting just one in your deck, maybe, to help matchups like Giratina and like Mega Man, where they struggle to hit these numbers, it could be quite nice. And just remain using your other attacks on your lower stages. Because that Grand Bolt doesn't seem too helpful. We know that 170 is a good number, but if you're using the Circle Circuit Raichu, you can hit those numbers a lot easier for less energy. And if you're using the Thunderclap Shot Raichu as well, it might be that you're looking to snipe the board rather than just do a big one to the face. So overall, I feel the attack isn't too helpful, but playing one Raichu Break in your Raichu deck anyway doesn't seem too detrimental, and it can help out in a couple of different matchups. So overall, the Raichus are fairly decent and definitely stuff to play around with there. Now let's look at probably the most well-defined archetype that we get from this new set, and that's going to be Magnezone. Pairing it with Raikou as well, another new card. First, let's look at Magnezone. It's a Stage 2 with 140 HP, Lightning type as well, with the ability Magnetic Circuit, and it's just like Inferno Fandango or Deluge that we've seen on Emboar and Blastoise of the past, but this time we have it for Lightning types, so we get to, as often as we like, attach a Lightning energy from our hand to one of our Pokemon. This is obviously awesome. There's a definite plethora of Lightning types that can benefit from this. He also has a fairly decent attack as well. You can do 100 base damage, discarding a Lightning attached to us. I mean, it's not great, but I guess if we are captured up, or if we really need to be a non-EX attacking to try and make it a 7-prize game, we can use Thunder Blast if we really have to. It can help us get around like Regice if we really need to, but for the most part we have Raikou anyway. But it's just something to bear in mind. You can sometimes attack with this guy if you're in a pinch. He does have that bulky retreat cost of 3, but it might make him slightly more searchable with Heavy Ball, so good and bad points to that. Quick note on the Magnemite, it's actually got a nice little ability to help you out. Its retreat cost is reduced by 1 for every other Magnemite in play, so oftentimes you're going to be free retreating with Magnemite if you use stuff like Bridget to fill your board of Raikus and Magnemites. So I feel like this is actually a pretty playable stage 2. We do get Skylar back in this set as a reprint, so being able to search out rare candies and other pieces. We have Trainer's Mail to start finding those combo pieces as well, so I feel like it is fairly consistent to get stage 2s out. Like I say, Toad is fairly reduced in play. It's not too big right now, so I think there is somewhat space for Magnezone in the format right now, especially because of how good Raichu is. Let's have a look at him. One of my favourite Pokemon in this set. 120 HP as a lightning type is pretty decent for a basic. Even better because of the ability Shining Body. If it has a lightning energy attached, you reduce damage done by 20. So that's really nice. Basically having 140 HP. You can slap Hard Charm on there as well if you really want to make it very bulky for a non-EX. We also have Rough Seas that combines as well, so reducing 40 and healing 30 in between turns makes this an absolute tank for a non-EX and a basic. You really don't need to commit much to this guy. And the attack as well is very nice. It's very reminiscent of Keldeo. In fact, it's the exact same with a different name. Thunderlance does 50, plus 20 more for each lightning energy attached to this Pokemon. And the cost is 3 colourless, so obviously combines with Magnezone. 110 each turn is perfect for two-shotting pretty much everything. We can increase the output if we really need to push for KOs as well. Again, with that Magnezone, so overall, I'm absolutely chuffed with this Raikou. It does have the weakness to fighting, but we do have Flash Energy if we really want to play a couple of those to get around the weakness. We can also play Zapdos that you can see in the top right corner, basically doing the same thing. If you're playing the Hard Charm Rough Seas build, having Resistance plus Hard Charm plus Rough Seas makes it difficult, very, very difficult for fighting decks to start killing this Zapdos, and its attacks aren't too bad either, so pretty okay there. And there's also a new Stunfisk as well, which is like a new Terrakion basically, but lightning type. It's Revenge that does 20, and if one of your Pokemon was knocked out during last turn, you get to do 80 more damage, so 100 damage is okay. Timesing that by 2 if you're hitting for weakness is decent. Stunfisk might be splashable in some decks, because we do have that new Smeargle, so it could be an interesting card just to deal with stuff weak to lightning like Lugia or Mega Rayquaza, so that's one to look out for as well. It could also find its way into the Raikou deck, because again, it's Heavy Ball searchable, which is kind of cool. There's also a Pikachu EX, which is definitely worth noting. It's not in the main set, but it will be coming out in a box, much like Tyrantrum has just come out. The Tyrantrum EX, which is quite playable, has come out in a box recently. We're getting a Pikachu, and it's an EX with 130 HP, so it's a bit of a glass cannon, because its attack does, for a lightning double colourless, you do 50, and discard as many lightning as you like attached to Pikachu, and you do 50 times that amount, so it's very reminiscent of Magnezone Prime, that did it back in the day, but put it in the Lost Zone, and that 50 times is really, really nice, combines with Magnezone perfectly as well, so it's interesting. You can almost take this deck in 2 routes. You could go for a tanky, all non-EX deck by using Raikou, or you could have a pretty much glass cannon deck in the form of Pikachu. It would be interesting to see how these two combine, if you play a mixture of both, maybe to finish off the game with a Pikachu whilst sort of stalling with Raikou and getting slow knockouts, or if you have mainly Pikachus and have 1 or 2 Raikou to slow the game down and make it 7 prize game and stuff like that. So it's going to be interesting how this works. I think there's definitely a deck here somewhere. The build itself is pretty much still up for debate. It's also good to bear in mind there's a new supporter, Fisherman. We don't have superior energy retrieval in standard right now, but Fisherman does sort of fill that void. We get to put 4 basics from our discard pile into the hand, but it does cost our supporter for the turn, so slightly weaker there. You might just play 1 and rely on VS Seekers to getting it back, and still play stuff like regular energy retrieval to get 2 back. So overall, I think the Raikou build is my personal favourite, but when the Pikachu comes out, it's pretty much up for debate to see how good that card is going to be. Definitely a very interesting one, and I would pick up as many Magnezones and Raikous as you can, because for the most part, these quote-unquote rain dance Pokemon have always been playable at some point in their lives, so picking up Magnezones, you're never really going to regret it. And that Raikou, it just has the nice ability, has a nice attack, and it's a basic non-EX, so pretty much everything going for it. I am a huge fan of these cards.